Welcome to Lafayette We Are Here, the French history podcast by a Frenchman. I'm your host, Emmanuel Dubois, and today we have a special episode. We have a guest, Louis Sarkozy, calling us from Washington, D.C., USA. And we're going to talk about Napoleon and his upcoming book on the Emperor. So please, Louis, introduce yourself to the listeners, your book, and where does your interest for history and Napoleon come from?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. So my name, as you said, is Louis Sarkozy, and I am just publishing the book entitled Napoleon's Library, The Emperor, His Books, and Their Influence on the Napoleonic Era. It's a book where I mostly look at the many books Napoleon read, both as a youth, but also as a general, as a statesman, and the impact that they had on his career as a strategist, as a reformer, as a politician, but also as just a man. What was he like alone by the campfire or under the tent at night? What sort of things did he read? So I tried to tell a story of his life through that book. This is my first work of history. I've written another book in France, but it was mostly philosophical, dialectical, on disagreement. Now it's about Napoleon. It's a figure that has fascinated me or obsessed me for quite some time. It's been about, I would say, 7 or 8 years since I was very deeply into the early 19th century and just overall the French Revolution and its immediate impact. And I would say everything started when I was a teenager, and I read Andrew Roberts' famed one-volume biography of Napoleon. I think it's 987 pages, and it hit me like few other books ever hit me. I knew, of course, who Napoleon was, but in the way that everybody knows as in learned about once or twice in school, but with no real comprehension. And I was just at that stage in a young man's life where one looks for heroes and icons and models and examples. And I got very lucky in that way because I found not only probably the greatest single man who have ever lived, full of faults, of course, that we may talk about, but just in terms of achievement, impact, just the epicness, not only of his life, but his era and his story, just at that right age. So I completely fell into his orbit. And the book, in many ways, was a way to get him out of my system, to finally write something, to publish something, and to move on to something else. But I'm afraid only time will tell if that will be successful.
Well, I think it's a great approach. We were discussing before recording. When we talk about Napoleon, it's always about the battles. It's always about the politics. It's always about this. Sometimes his love life, even though I don't think it's that relevant. But you are talking about the man himself, what he cared about, and obviously reading and his books were central to his life. And from childhood until the very end. And if we care so much about the emperor, it's in good part because of what he wrote and what others wrote about him and what he read. And, I think it's essential to any man's life, what they read, what they absorb. I mean, if you were to come to my house, the first thing you would notice is the books. I have books all over the place, and I think it says a lot about a person, how much they read and what they read. So I think this is very relevant and not nearly enough talked about. We tend to see him as an archetype of some sort. We tend to forget he was a man, with all his qualities and faults. But as any man, he grew from zero to what he became, and his literature was a big part of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's Benjamin Disraeli who said of himself that he was born in a library. And another quote is, give me the library and I'll give you the man. And it's certainly true. If you were to look at my library, like I'm sure if you looked at yours, you could tell quite a lot about us. Just for example, I think in my shelves, over 60 or 70% has to do with history. So clearly you can deduce a lot, and nowhere is this more true than with Napoleon. And really at different stages of his life, his books say so much about him. So when he's a young kid, he's bullied pretty ruthlessly. When he arrives in France, he speaks with a very thick accent that, in fact, he will keep for the rest of his life. There are rumors that his mother was unfaithful, and he's the bastard son of the Comte de Marbeuf, the French governor of Corsica. His skin color was a bit different. They called it olive skin, and so here he's incredibly proud to be Corsican. He's fanatically devout to Pascal Paoli, the great hero of Corsican independence, and he arrives in this aristocratic school, not the most famous military school, but a pretty good military school in France, filled with all these little aristocrats who pick on him ruthlessly. And so he falls into books as a sort of protective shell. And specifically, he falls into history. He reads Plutarch and Cornelius Nepos and Tacitus and Livy pretty religiously. And daydreams about the Carthaginians and the Romans and Alexander the Great and the Greeks, but also reads the history of the Arabs, of the history of the successive caliphates. So history is sort of his protective shell, and at least I argue that this is where you can first see the emergence of the just gnawing ambition that was to define him. And a little later on, he when he's a more established military cadet and later lieutenant, he reads a lot of strategy. And you can actually devise, and if you read what he read, for example, there's a very famous, back then was very famous, strategic treatise that today is completely forgotten and nobody ever cares about, nobody knows, called the Traité stratégique of a guy called Jacques-Antoine Hippolyte de Guibert, who was very famous at the time as being a military strategist. In fact, Madame de Staël wrote an ode to him and to his thinking. And you can find in Guibert a lot of the things that would later characterize Napoleonic warfare and the famous corps system. So his readings may have had a quite direct impact on the corps system, and later on he reads also stuff on romance. He was a big fan of romance and the sort of the love triangle, the start of the romantic movement of romanticism. He was part of the first European generation to be exposed to it, and that also influences his love life. So at every stage of his life, if you look at what he's reading, you can see where the thing is heading. And I think this is most emblematic when he's emperor, when he's no longer sort of a curious kid or a curious lieutenant. Now he has, the totality of the fiscal and administrative resources of France at his disposal. He builds these great palatial libraries. He has a dedicated librarian and bibliographic staff, which buys and treats and organizes these vast libraries. And before every campaign, before the Austerlitz campaign, before the Second Italian campaign, all of this time, he collects hundreds, if not thousands, of texts on the relevant theater's geography, on the population statistics, on the agricultural output, on the rivers and the mountains and the topography, on the previous campaigns fought there. And so he arrives at these battles with what today would be considered vital intelligence that is denied to his enemies. And the books were so important under him and under the First French Empire that, if you were a clever observer and perhaps a clever enemy spy, and you saw, say, in the months before the 1806 Prussian campaign, that suddenly the emperor collected hundreds of books on Prussia and East Prussia and Poland, you would know where the French armies were headed next. So books under the First French Empire were literally matters of national security. They constituted, the information they gave to him constituted essentially what today would be vital military intelligence network. So books are not just a pastime or even a tool for Napoleon. It's really, I argue, what everything is built around. So it's a fascinating window into his mind, both personally but also professionally.
It makes a lot of sense when we know how Napoleon's career went about. I often recall when I was researching him, his relationship with Berthier, his chief of staff. This man was basically the logistics chief, and Napoleon was, the war leader. But these two together were a force to be reckoned with. I mean, Berthier would prepare all the maps, lay them out for him, but Napoleon would memorize them. He would look at a map and he has it in his head, and then he would apply this on the battlefield the next day or the next weeks. So, what I find impressive about this man, I mean, you can love Napoleon, you can hate him, But you cannot deny his intelligence and his capacity to absorb information and make use of that information. I mean, it's one thing to read books, it's another to understand them and to use them with intelligence. And I think he did both. Sometimes, of course, he made tons of mistakes. I mean, you basically rule over France and then you wage war over Europe. Yeah, you're gonna make mistakes. There is no way around it. But I find also very interesting the part in his whole career, the consulate, where I find that he made great use of all that knowledge to modernize France and Europe in a way that nobody had ever done before him. And we still live, people don't often acknowledge that. Our societies, at least in the West, are very built upon what was made at the turn of the 19th century. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the worlds we live in, the values we fight for, or our fathers fought for, or grandfathers fought for, they come from that era. Liberty, freedom of press, freedom of association, those were never heard of really before that period. And Napoleon was at the center of that whole, how can I put it, that whole philosophical and political change. And he was a force for change, whether you like it or not. At some point he had to be conservative, but it was not to be stupid conservative, because he had to calm things down. But on other fronts, he could be very in advance from his contemporaries. So I find that, from what you are telling me, he read all this history, those classics, those strategists, but also those contemporary readers. From what I understand from your book, he read a lot of the Lumière authors, and he would take those ideals into his reign. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was a whole part of his life and what he strived to achieve in later years. A good example of that is the Code Civil, or the Code Napoleon, that we often talk about. And it's often a subject I know when I listen, especially to English language podcast, there's a big lack of understanding of the Napoleonic Code, in the sense that, no, Napoleon did not write the code himself, nobody is claiming that, but he was the chairman of an organization putting this into effect. So to me, if there is no Napoleon on the helm, there is no Napoleonic Code. And the effects that has over the next 2 centuries to our day are tremendous. I mean, basically half of the countries on Earth have some variant of the code in their laws. So I think it's a perfect example of Napoleon having all that knowledge about history, about politics, about what you just said, other cultures, about other countries, and absorbing all this and making something very concrete with it.
Yeah, and in fact, that's perfectly said. That's exactly the Napoleonic legacy. It's the concrete. It's the transfer of great sounding but very academic and intellectual ideas into the concrete. And that is perfectly encapsulated in the Civil Code. Now, people say, "Oh, but there were many people who had the ideas of a unifying code before." Yes, but they didn't do it, or they couldn't do it. With Napoleon, and this is true for the strategy, it's true for the code, you get an idea that was somewhat stuck in books or in committees and never could get off the ground. And he sits the people together and he sets the course and he says, okay, now we're going to make it happen. Thierry Lenz, the director of the Fondation Napoléon, says Napoleon's reign is the reign of the serious. Things actually get done, right? And it's the same thing with Guibert. Guibert was a soldier, but he never really put into practice all of his strategic insights. The fact, for example, that you need smaller armies that move faster, that perhaps you dispense with the heavy woolen tents, that you let soldiers sleep outside, that it's not a good idea to travel as one big mass, that you should try to have armies forage for supplies rather than carrying heavy supply trains. He just wrote about it, but it took Napoleon to get these ideas and to put them into place. And I think you're also right when you talk about his heritage of the Lumière, of the Enlightenment. He was a man of the Enlightenment. Roberts famously says, he's the Enlightenment on horseback. And it makes the often repeated and ludicrous accusation that he's some type of proto-Hitler absolutely absurd. I mean, Napoleon was the child of the revolution. He comes to power and champions what is essentially a very left-leaning, in fact, a radically left-wing movement. at the time, Napoleon's greatest enemies were the established conservative aristocratic monarchies of Europe. His enemies were the Ancien Régime. Right. He's not, and today we associate him with this authoritative right wing. He was a child of the revolution. He was a child of the most radical left movement in European history up at that point. So we must not confuse here. I mean, he was seen as a dangerously left winger, at least in the beginning of his career. And he says himself, another literary reference. He says after the horrors of the revolution, we must finish the novel of the revolution, and now we must start to write its history. And in that quote, I love that quote so much, not only because it's a literary reference, but also because it encapsulates exactly what he did. He stops with all the nonsense of the revolution. So he stops with the absurd new calendar of 10 days. He starts renaming the seasons. He stops with the nonsense of the cult of the supreme being. He ends the war in the Vendée, the civil war that was tearing apart the west of France. He stops with the appel au meurtre and the mass guillotinings and the terror. He ends all of that, but he keeps the at least initially the hard-won freedoms that were established, the liberty of the citizen, the equality before the law. He ends the privileges, but he also brings back the church into France with the Concordat. So his work is a work of synthesis. And in fact, his main objective was to marry what he called the two nobilities, the nobility of the Ancien Régime, which he invites to come back after the mass emigrations, and the new revolutionary nobility, the Jacobins and later on the nobles of the empire, the newly minted nobles. And we can argue whether he was successful or not, but that's what he wants, to marry the two nobilities, to heal the wounds, to modernize France, and to set it forward for the 19th century. So it's really an incredibly beneficial reign, at least in the beginning, that he has. We may talk about what happens in the later empire because he himself changes completely. But the first years, as you mentioned, of the consulate up until 1807, I mean, it's really a work of modernizing. It's a work of synthesizing the two nobilities, of keeping the glories of the revolution and the good things and getting rid of the bad. I mean, in many ways, he saved and stabilized France. So for that, at least, he should be absolutely recognized and honored.
Yes, I totally agree. And I recall when I was a student, we would call the 1815 Vienna Congress the victory of conservative Europe. It's totally what it was, in the sense that you're perfectly correct. Napoleon was a force from this new movement that was created by the French Revolution. I mean, no French Revolution, no Napoleon. I mean, no question asked. If there is not that huge tremor in Europe, he would have been maybe a very successful general, I don't know, but he would not have become what he became. He was a child of that, and he was at the perfect time, at the perfect moment, so he was lucky in that sense. And I agree that the later part of his reign are not as bright as the first part. We'll talk about it a bit later, and for many reasons. Some is fault, some are others' faults. I mean, it's anything but simple, but it is fascinating. And I do agree that it's often misunderstood, classified as right-wing extremist, especially it's retaken these days by right-wing people trying to use Napoleon's image to their advantage, which I find is a shame. I mean, using historical figures to your own political gain is always, I find, not ideal. Let's put it this way. It should be part of culture and history and not used as a tool to gain votes or support or what have you. But in that case, it's true that it's the fault of both Napoleon's detractors, who want to classify him as some Hitler, as you just said, which is historical nonsense, and also by some people that will just use his figure to make themselves look better, which is not that great too. I want to talk about your book. So in your work, in your research, you looked at what Napoleon's read and what he made of all those readings. And how did this reading evolve during his life? That's something I want to talk about. Like, you talk about all the history that he read when he was at Brienne, the military school, when he was a teenager. And he read about history, about strategy, and then romance and all that stuff. So how did his reading evolve throughout his life?
So that's a very good question. So when he's young, as I said, I mean, he practically reads only history. And that's because he's fascinated by history, but also we must remember he's at a state royal military academy. So he's not likely to find there the works of the philosophes, people like Rousseau and Voltaire. It's not exactly what the monks wanted the kids to read. I mean, this was a very conservative institution, so he's not yet into that. But once he graduates, he goes to the École Militaire of Paris, where he really falls into the strategy and keeps reading history. By the way, I should say he reads history his entire life. I mean, it's what all of his libraries were majoritively history for, I mean, from his 10th birthday to his last. He mostly read history. So that is a constant throughout his life. But he evolves. So after the École Militaire, he completely falls into the realm of the philosophe. He reads, for example, the massive encyclopedic work of the Abbé Raynal, Histoire des deux Indes, which again today is practically forgotten. Back then was seen as probably the text which did the most in the literary world to bring about the French Revolution. It's this massive history of colonialism, but it's really more of an encyclopedia with articles on philosophy, politics, epistemology, history, slavery. It covers everything. And, this was a very anti-revolutionary, anti-colonialist tract. He reads that. He reads Rousseau and becomes obsessed with Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he's a young guy. He's very bored in garrison duty in the years leading up to the French Revolution. He doesn't do much. And so he starts to read Rousseau. He falls completely in love and he wants to copy Rousseau's life in a way and wants to become a writer. And so that's when Napoleon starts writing. And he starts to try to become a sort of proto-philosopher historian. So he writes, for example, he tries to write a history of Corsica, which never gets off the ground and he never finishes, but he sends a manuscript to Raynal and asks him. He writes multiple short stories. So he writes a very weird short story called The Masked Prophet. And it's this just bizarre story of a Middle Eastern Islamic prophet which poisons his own followers. I mean, it's a very, very strange story, and everybody ends up dying. All his short stories when he's a young kid are very violent. He writes a revanchist revenge fantasy about a Corsican father who sees his daughter raped by French soldiers, and he goes on a killing spree, slaughtering French soldiers, even killing French children. I mean, a very, very violent sort of teenagey angst story. He writes also short philosophical tracts. He enters an essay contest organized by Raynal, who he had met, the author of the Histoire des deux Indes, and he writes a very verbose and confusing document. Prompt of the essay contest is, what are the qualities necessary to instill in men for them to be happy, basically? And he writes this thing, you can read it 50 times, you still don't know what he's trying to say. I mean, it's incredibly confusing. Everything stinks of him being a teenager. But what all those readings say is that he had been reading a lot of Rousseau and a lot of philosophers. So then that's his sort of emotional teenagey time. And then when his military career starts to pick up, and suddenly he gets very popular, he's a general, he is triumphant in Italy, and that's when he sort of gives up on the philosophers. And it's very funny. Jean Tullard, the great French historian, seems to say that there's a moment when he decides that his life will not be about thinking anymore, it will be about doing. Very conscious decision. He gives up the plume in favor of the sword. He gives up trying to become a writer. He stops writing fiction or essays, and he now he focuses solely on the military aspect. So he gives up on Rousseau to the point that, years later, he visits Rousseau's tomb in Hermonville, and he stands over the tomb. This is a man who he has idolized. He's read almost everything he's written, and he plagiarized him and copied him and wanted to model his life after him. So Rousseau is a huge influence on Napoleon, and he abandons Rousseau so much that he stands over his grave and says to the groundskeeper, time will tell if it would not have been better for the repose of the world had this man and I never been born. Right. So the divorce is complete, right? So he goes from a fanatical adherent to Rousseau and to the philosophe, to completely abandoning them. And he transforms himself from an idealist, emotional, kid who likes philosophy to sort of a hardened, pragmatist warrior who only wants the concrete, and then begins a lifelong obsession with politics and with what we call the raison d'etat, sort of realpolitik. And then he starts to read more and more politics. He reads Montesquieu. He reads also and attends many, many, many theatrical performances and reads many plays. One of the aspects I cover in the book, he went so throughout his 15-year reign, he averages one theater attendance per week for 15 years. So incredibly, incredibly passionate about the theater, reads and talks a lot about the theater, even becomes a theatrical critique, loves above all Corneille, exactly because Corneille had such a political side to his plays, and also reads and watches Voltaire's plays and Racine's plays. But in all of the plays he likes, it's always about the political. So he loves a play about called Les Templiers, about the famous, eradication of the Templar order. And he says, famously, because the particular play portrays the reason why Philippe le Bel destroyed the order as sort of a personal reason. And Napoleon says, no, that's all wrong. We don't care about the characters. It should have been that Philippe le Bel did this because it was for the good of the state. And that's sort of a typical Napoleonic remark. Everything should be around the political. Everything should be around the state. And so that continues throughout his life, the obsession with politics, the obsession with history, up until the very end, where, he's finally exiled. And then his last readings, famously, and we can talk about that if you like, but he has a lot of trouble getting books at the end of his life. It's sort of very disheartening and very emotional as a researcher to read some of these notes and letters, because this is a man who had everything, quite literally was the master of Europe. At some point, wanted to get a copy of every book published in the world. So his ambitions, his literary ambitions, were towering. And at the end of his life, he can't even get the books that he wants because the English are being incredibly hard on him. They're refusing books to be sent. Nobody really cares. Everybody's trying to forget him. And so at the end, there's a sort of synthesis. He sort of rereads whatever he has on hand, but he rereads a lot of what he's read before, and he tries to get new arrivals, but he really is having trouble. So he rereads his correspondence. He rereads the plays that he loved. For example, some of his companions on St. Helena, there were some plays that he was reading so much, and he insisted on reading them aloud with everybody there, that they purposefully lost some books so that the emperor wouldn't make them read it again. So it's a very touching story. And at the end, the books are pretty much all that he has. So there's definitely phases, but I would say if your listeners were to remember one thing, is that history is the predominant category. I mean, history, he says, is the one true philosophy. And in his last writings, he says, let my son read nothing but history. I mean, to him, it was the predominant subject. It was almost like his religion.
Hopefully the listeners will agree and they will listen to my podcast more and more. It's a good ad.
I happen to agree with Napoleon and with you. History is the one true philosophy, and it's what everybody should study a little more of.
Yeah, and I would not be surprised. I mean, it's funny when you talk about the sheer quantity and quality of what Napoleon read and all the plays he attended and all that stuff. I wonder how much our current politicians do that stuff.
Yeah.
In comparison, yeah. I understand it's a different way of life,
but it's not. But it's not though, and that's the great lesson about my research, is that we've all heard people, including our elected leaders, say, I wish I could read more, but I simply don't have the time. Napoleon led armies in person. Not only did he lead them in person, he obsessed over every logistical and strategic and tactical detail. This is a man who remembered where each battalion was supposed to go and march and sleep on a 600-mile march. He knew where every single unit was supposed to be. He literally, I think we have over 60 surviving letters which just concern the army's socks or the army's coat buttons. He led them in person. He fought the battles in person. He devised a strategy in person. He also governed France, the greatest country in the world at that time. And the most powerful. He reformed the country's legal and social infrastructure. I mean, he touched everything, and he read obsessively, constantly every day. So next time you hear the excuse of one of our elected leaders or even a friend saying, I wish I could read more, but I don't have the time, you can immediately discredit it. I mean, you know that person is full of if you allow my language. I mean, that it's an admission of being dishonest. I mean, it simply cannot be true that you do not have the time, given what Napoleon's schedule was like and what he read. And also, I might add, given what the average screen time is for some of our contemporaries. I mean, that is the worst excuse that one can say.
Yeah, I agree. And for example, just to put a personal thing here, I always try to read about 50 books a year. It's not much, but it's not nothing either. But I know most people do read like 50 pages a year, so I feel good about it. And
you should.
And but what I do is I'm like you. I mean, I have a full-time job, I have a family, I have this podcast, I have this and that and that. And I could say, oh, I don't have the time. But what I do, I always have a book in my backpack. When I have 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, or before going to bed, what have you, you read 10 pages, 20 pages. You'd be surprised the amount of reading you do if you stick to it.
I couldn't agree more. I usually have a tendency of getting to meetings or dinners or lunches about 20 minutes or 30 minutes early. That's my little hack. And then you just read for that time. It's also like reading should be treated like, in a way, working out. It is non-negotiable. Right? We not only because it's good for the brain and it's good for comprehension, it is just reading should be in your top 3 priorities of what you want to do. Like, I should be healthy, I should be a good father, husband, and a good employee, or a good CEO, or whatever you are. But reading should be in that list. Like, it is so fundamentally important. Very few things are more important, in fact, than reading what has been written. I mean, whatever we go through in life, loss, disease, absolute disasters, the whole list, everything that we face and that we will face in our stricken human lives has already been faced. And what is more, it's already been faced by people who had a literary genius. And these people have written about it, whether it's heartbreak, whether it's death, whether it's grief, but also triumph. So not consulting the historical record for guidance and advice and reassurance and companionship is quite literally insane. I mean, we have a endless mine of wisdom and grace and knowledge and culture. To not benefit from that mine, would be tantamount to insanity. I mean, this is the greatest gift our ancestors left us. They've written with their incredible talent and experiences, and it's here for us, and we have to utilize it.
And it's never been so accessible as today. I mean, you get yourself an ebook, a reader, you can have 8,000 books in your pocket.
You can have, within a finger's click, the totality of human knowledge accessible to mankind within a 5-minute download. I mean, it is surreal how accessible it is now.
Yeah, so you've heard it. No excuse. Don't be lazy. Read books, and it's completely true. That's good. I call it good for the soul. It is important for a person. Whatever you like reading. Like for myself, of course, I read a lot of history, but for fiction, I read a lot of science fiction. That's the genre I like because I find the exploring of ideas very interesting and very relevant for the human mind. But that's me. So read whatever you like, romances, mystery, thrillers, what have you. But read something, for God's sake. It's so important. And it obviously was important for our friend Napoleon here, throughout his whole life. And that brings us to actually our next point. It's a good segue. There's still a good public fascination for the character of Napoleon, for the emperor, for the man, for the general, all his different aspects, because he is a man of different aspects, and as you said before, he changed a lot throughout his life. So basically, why are we still talking so much about him over 200 years after he died? His regime has died, he died. Basically, some people could call him a failure. What he tried to do, oh, sorry, you failed, 1815, we won. And you look at it 200 years later, you go, it's not that simple. There is actually a good a huge part of it that actually survived, but it did take more time than intended. So, what do you think is so important for us today in our era regarding Napoleon's maybe legacy?
Well, it's a great question, and there's multiple things to be said. Why, if you show a picture of the hat to anybody in the world, you get a pretty good chance that they know who that is from. I mean, that is a remarkable, right? I mean, in many ways, you can talk about some other great figures of French history, Louis XIV, Richelieu, Clemenceau. They're not nearly as famous as him. I mean, he has managed a level of fame which is unmatched in world history. Why is that? Well, one, he was a master of propaganda and communication. Master. The amount of things that he had published or had drawn or painted is absurd. I mean, just today, we have over 40,000 surviving letters of him. At some point in the later months of 1807, he averaged over 19 letters a day. Right? So that's more than what Donald Trump averaged tweeted per day during his presidency. I mean, that is absolutely an immense amount of literary output. After every great battle, he made declarations and he had paintings commissioned. Right. So he really knew how to get into his contemporaries' minds, and it worked. So that's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that his life is quite literally unbelievable. Right? And this is best summed up by a British sailor who was on the ship with him when he was finally sailing to St. Helena, HMS Northumberland. And after 9 weeks at sea, that sailor, I forget his name, but says basically something along the lines of, he made us realize what was possible in a short human life. Right? Napoleon dies at 51. He dies very young. In 15 years of reign, the man revolutionizes Europe, touches everything: politics, legislation, policy, legal, the legal infrastructure, revolutionizes warfare, leaves an indelible mark in literature and music and theater and opera. I mean, the man touches everything. And so, in many ways, his story and his achievements sort of gave hope to a generation of people, even if they disagreed with him, even if they hated him. It's, oh my God, look what is achievable in one short human lifespan. I mean, this is a man who came from low and unremarkable Corsican nobility, Corsica being a backwater, and who, in a matter of a decade, elevates himself to the highest circles of power, eventually secures power for himself, and beats and humbles the most famous and prestigious European monarchies who had been around for thousands of years. I mean, it's unbelievable. And then, even more amazing, he loses everything. So in his story, the rise, the shattering rise, is just as amazing and unbelievable as the catastrophic fall. I mean, from nothing to everything and to nothing again. He's the prototypical tragic figure. I don't think, Sophocles could have written something better. I mean, this is a man who just sort of espouses the perfect Greek tragedy. And his fall, of course, and he himself knew this, did just as much to secure his fame as anything else. In fact, and this is one of the chapters that ends the book, but it's a book which makes him so famous and becomes one of the best sellers of the 19th century, and it's the Memorial of St. Helena. So he goes to St. Helena on his final exile. He's going to spend 6 years there before dying. And he takes with him a guy called the Count of Las Casas. And Las Casas is a trained writer. And the two of them produced during the first year of exile from 1815 to 1816 a manuscript of basically a day-to-day account of what Napoleon was doing on St. Helena, the conversations the two men had, etc. And it is a masterful work of propaganda. And it literally creates what would later turn out to be the Bonapartism of the later 19th and early 20th century. Napoleon the liberal, Napoleon the nationalist, all things that he was not at all during his reign, but that he wants the world to think he was or to remember him. So he manages to build his legend through that book, I mean, it's the perfect coronation. It's the perfect culmination to a life spent around books, is that it's a book that finally cements his legend. That's another aspect of why he is so famous. And yet another one, and again, this list is extensive, but another one is something that people don't talk that much about, but it's one of the impacts he had that people ignore. But the man pretty much creates archaeology and Egyptology. The Egyptian expedition, when he's still a young kid, he's in his late 20s. He wants to colonize Egypt and turn it into a French satrapy. The government wants to, and he takes on a great army and a great navy. But with the army and with the navy, he brings hundreds of poets, singers, scientists, cartographers, balloonists, archaeologists, experts, engineers, map makers, cartographers, the savants, the famed savants, and they unlock Egypt that had been completely unknown quantity to Europe. They discover the Rosetta Stone, famously, which leads to the unlocking of the hieroglyphs. They unearth all the temples. They catalog all of the wildlife. They catalog all of the plants. They make the most accurate maps in the history of the African continent. They print the first documents in the history of the African continent. They assemble the first elected assembly in the history of the African continent. And that kickstarts a century or more of what is called Egyptomania, fascination with all things Egyptian. People in Europe and even in America for centuries would dress in Egyptian styles, buy Egyptian perfumes, have lotus flowers and sphinxes and pyramids and obelisks populate the landscapes and populate graves and monuments and public buildings. So that's another. The birth of archaeology is really traceable to that moment, and the birth of Egyptology is traceable to that moment. So no matter where you touch the 19th century European history and world history, you see his handprint. And perhaps I should say one more thing to the Code Civil, the thing you mentioned earlier. The Code Civil is not just a compilation of laws. It's not just a list of what's allowed and not allowed. The Code Civil is the conception of society. Okay, what should our society look like? How do we organize society? It's really what it is. It is the creation with legal means of a society. And it's so successful that today, in 2024, half of all of the articles of law active on the French territory today are from the Napoleonic Code. It's copied by most other European countries. It's copied by South American countries after their independence movement. So the legal infrastructure, I mean, any lawyer listening to this will have spent a couple days or weeks on the Napoleonic Code. I mean, and again, this is also traceable to his reading, by the way. He reads the Codex of Justinian. He reads the Chinese Penal Code. I mean, he reads legal codes from everywhere. So again, his readings have a big impact. But this is another reason. So in archaeology, Egyptology, in fashion, he has an impact. In legal, jurisdictional, he has an impact. He reforms the military. Every army in the world will copy the core system after him. He creates modern France, all the institutions that survive to this day, the Cour des Comptes, le Conseil d'État, which still meets every Wednesday. He builds the sewers, he builds the temples, he builds the large public buildings, he builds the bridges. He creates the grid city system, the numbered city system with opposite numbers on each side. I mean, so in a short reign, he touches everything. Right. And that's why he's so famous. It's because not only of the propaganda, the communication, but because of just the unimaginable far reach of his legacy. At least that's my argument as to why he's so famous.
Pretty comprehensible argument. And I would say also, when you talk about the Egyptian campaign, I always found that this period of time, I find that it encapsulates Napoleon's reign perfectly, because he comes in with the scientist, the famous savant, which means basically the knowledgeable ones, if you will, to have a literal translation. And he comes in, wins the first battles, but in the end, it is a military defeat for the French. Yes. There is the Battle of the Nile when we lose the fleet, and in the end, on the ground, we lose too. But Napoleon comes back and he's hailed as a hero. How does that happen? The guy basically lost. You could argue that he fled. And nevertheless, he comes back to France and he's hailed as a hero. Why is that? First, as you said, all that new world that he unlocked is making him famous, like the whole Egyptian thing. And also, as you said before, he's a master of propaganda. He understood that before becoming a general. That's something I was found fascinating about him. He understands that perception is as important as action when you are in a leading role. When you're up there and you're leading troops or people, the perception they have of you matters a lot. If you want to be followed, if you want to be trusted, if you want to actually do something. And he played that, as you said, he wrote a lot, he had newspapers written for him, sent back to France. And so when he comes back, everybody's in Paris dressed in an Egyptian fashion and he's waiting for him and hails him as this great person, even though the French actually have to flee Egypt and the few remaining troops will be captured by the British.
And listen, there's so many aspects to the Egyptian campaign, and it's really, I've often asked this question to my friends. If you could take a walk or spend an afternoon in any place at any time in world history, like where would you go for an afternoon? And for the longest time, my answer has always been, oh, easy. The triumph that Augustus stages as soon as he beats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the ultimate start to the empire, the heyday of it. But the Egyptian expedition, when you have all of these, it's tough to call them scientists because they were not. The modern science had not yet really been organized, and they were not scientists. They were polymaths and intellectuals and academics, but not yet scientists. But all these, some of the smartest men in Europe, cut off from the outside world in a hostile country. They basically commandeer an old Mamluk palace, and they have their meetings in a room that used to be the harem, where untold, ungodly things used to happen there. And they talk about the flight potential of ostriches. And they talk about whether it's possible to grow hops and make beer and bread in Egypt. And they talk about some of the historical artifacts that they discovered, and they dissect birds, and so it's this explosion of knowledge. And also, and this is really pointed out in a great book, which I forget the name, about the expedition, by this wonderful journalist, this lady, I also forget her name, but she basically points out that all of these academics who were in incredibly hierarchical and siphoned off and exclusive circles back in Paris, suddenly they're all together in this one building or complex of buildings in Egypt in hostile territory, and it allows for a cross-pollination of ideas, which was impossible back home. And you have this effervescence, this explosion of knowledge and cooperation amongst all these fields. I mean, you have cartographers and balloonists and biologists and sculptors talking, working together. So it's really an amazing period. And it's full of drama. Like during the Great Revolt of Cairo, they're besieged in their building. So you have these, awkward nerds, talking about dissecting ostriches, suddenly, flinging stones at attacking Egyptians trying to defend their building. It's an exceptional episode. And today, a lot of our contemporaries look at that as, colonialism, disgusting, throw it in the dustbin. And it's sort of, it's ignoring the immense contribution that particular episode had. And I maintain, and I will maintain, and I'll die on this hill, that this is almost entirely attributable to Napoleon. If it was Menou who was leading the expedition, I don't think he would have brought 180 savants. If it was anybody else, I mean, from the moment they arrive in Egypt, the savants knew Napoleon's their protector. The other soldiers, most of them hated him because when things started to go badly, the soldiers were like, "Oh, we're here because of these, and we have to defend them when they take measurements, and we have to go die when they collect their specimens." And as soon as Napoleon left, their position's in danger, their artifacts are in danger of being surrendered to the British. Nobody in the French army wants to protect them, so he's really responsible for bringing them. So it's another of his fascinating legacies, and it speaks to his love of culture, his love of all things literary, and all of the great achievements of the Egyptian expedition is compiled into a book, La Description de l'Égypte, which popularizes the expedition. And once again, at this stage of his life, it's a book which does everything to cement the Napoleonic legacy. So that's why I spend so much time in my book on it. It's because at all these stages, you realize that Napoleon's life is really a literary life, and it's book that punctuates all the great chapters.
Yes, that's really fascinating, and I completely agree with the importance of that whole endeavor. And to me, the fact that they have all these savants together in a room discussing all these subjects, first, it's very inscribed in the encyclopedic approach that the French had with the Enlightenment, the creation of the encyclopedia. You're in that same kind of spirit, so they're like the continuation of that. Plus, but Napoleon does something more. Not only he brings them together, he gives them potency. These guys are important. That's what he's saying to the world. These nerds, as you call them, they are important for the next step. They are very important for our next step in society. And this will come to fruition in the 19th century with what we call positivism, when we have scientists and engineers and people striving to make our lives better. And people go, wow. I mean, you look at somebody's life in 1685 and you look at their life in 1785, it's more or less the same. 1785 to 1885, it's day and night. The world has moved on so much on every aspect, from what is available to you as services, as healthcare, as tools, as institution. Everything has completely changed, and that starts with these guys in the Egyptian desert. They're part of that movement that will change the world forever. And of course, there will be faults, but I would say mostly for good. They brought way more good than ill by doing that. And to me, it's a different discussion than colonialism. Colonialism has a huge amount of faults. I'm not saying it's not. I mean, I did an episode about French Indochina. Some of the stuff the French did over there is atrocious, but this is something different. This is literally what the savant did. I mean, I don't think you can deny the good that this brought to the world. And that brings me to our next subject when we're talking about good and bad. Napoleon himself, as a man, which you have studied so much, and you have tried to get in his brain as much as you can, more than just looking at his successes and failures. If I were to ask you, what do you think were rather his biggest qualities as a man, and something that stuck with him his whole life, and also his biggest faults as a man? What do you think are the things that he should really have worked on and he failed to do?
It's such a great question. His biggest qualities. So he was incredibly strange as a man. In fact, there's a remark he makes at some point. I forget who he's talking to, but he says something along the lines. He's talking to some of the marshals, I think, and he says offhand, he says, "You people won't understand." Okay, what does he mean by "you people"? Does he mean the military? But he is a soldier. So I quite like to think that by "you people" he means everybody else on the planet. He knew he was completely different. This is a man who probably never had friends. Although he shows an incredible amount of loyalty and is very protective of his family and some of his old companions of school. For example, there's this great episode. He sees a former classmate of his who's in need of a job, who's poor, who's down on his luck. And the guy's asking for a job. Napoleon agrees. The guy leaves. Napoleon sends an officer after him in the street, says, "Oh, you must have forgotten this," and gives him cash. Because he knew that the guy was too proud to accept just a donation. So he's, "Oh, you must have." So in many ways, he looks out for his friends, but he's never that close to them. He looks out for his family, but he's never that close to them. I mean, there's this weird ambivalence. He's very protective. He has the Corsican mentality of the clan, and that's very touching. But he's quite ready to move on after one of his buddies dies. Very quickly, he makes offhand remarks that are very distasteful. He's very cold. So he's very, very strange. But nonetheless, I would say one of his best qualities is that fundamentally he was not a bad guy. I mean, fundamentally he was fairly decent and fairly protective of the people who had helped him in most cases. There's some exceptions, but in most cases. He was also incredibly curious, and this is something I've always been biased towards curious people, always striving to learn and to study more. He was a man who, at least in the beginning, was quite ready to realize when he had made a mistake. Also, something that I find is getting progressively rarer in our times. And for for the negative aspects, he's a man with almost no sense of humor. He can be incredibly ruthless, and especially in the later reign, he sort of is so convinced of his own epicness that, I mean, absolute power corrupts absolutely. He becomes completely aloof to reality and makes a series of blunders that are unforgivable. And I mean, we must say, but he has on his hands the blood of all the victims of the Russian campaign. I mean, it's the greatest disaster in military history. It's a war that did not need to be fought, and it speaks to the sort of disconnect that he progressively had with the reality at the end of the reign. So that is definitely something that we hold against him. He also could be incredibly cruel, but in the petty kind. I mean, Josephine has this amazing phrase to him. She says, "Sire, you humiliate a lot, but punish little." And that's true. He humiliates people. He humiliates Talleyrand without punishing him. He humiliates Fouché in the beginning without punishing him. So he makes enemies without pushing them far enough so that they're harmless. And that's one of his great faults. He likes to humiliate people publicly, very disgusting thing. And that's definitely something you could feel if you were to have dinner with him or something. He was quite ready to flip on somebody. He could be vicious in his emotional anger episodes. Some of them were staged, some of them were not, but he could be incredibly vicious. But overall, I think when you calculate and analyze all of his character attributes, you come to that famous quote which says it's fascinating to read and to study great men, but it's hell to live under them. And I think that works with him more than anything. He was an amazing man to study, to read about. His impact is undeniable, but I think having served under him would have been pretty close to a nightmare. I mean, you could devote your life to him, and in a split second, he was quite ready to throw you into the fray. And he has that disgusting phrase. He says, you can never beat me. I spend 30,000 men a month. It's part of why, after so many years on the battlefield, he must have been experiencing not some sort of PTSD, but he became so cold to the tragedies of war. I mean, at some point, Laplace, the great mathematician, he sees Napoleon. He's one of his former teachers, and Laplace, Napoleon's like, "Oh, how you doing?" And Laplace says, "Sire, I'm doing quite poorly. I just lost my daughter." And Napoleon says, "Oh, what do you mean? You are a mathematician. Put that into an equation, and you see that it equates zero." Incredibly awful thing to say to a grieving father. But again, it speaks to the disconnect that he had to death and suffering towards the later part of his life. So it's a mixed bag. I probably would not want to have dinner with him, mostly because he's never sat down at a table for more than 15 minutes. And so was unable to hold for any kind. He was a workaholic. He would get up after 15 minutes and go work, and never able to finish a glass of wine. But fundamentally, I don't think he was a bad guy. I think power corrupted him. I think years and decades of war rendered him much worse than he was when he was younger. I hope that answers your question.
It does, and
part, if I just may finish, I mean,
sure.
Just one last point. Part of he's an enigma today. And that's another reason why people are so fascinated by him. Nobody was able to solve the mystery. Nobody really knows what went on inside his head. Nobody really knows or explains some of his actions. I mean, he fascinates so much because we know so much, and yet we know so little. He really is an enigma. And as Charles-Éloi Vial, the great French historian, told me, in 2 centuries, nobody has been able to crack him open.
I agree, and I think, as you said, it's part of his legend and why we still talk about him. And just to your points, about the fact that he could be so loyal and so good to his people and also so cruel at the same time. Let's take, for example, after a battle, let's say Austerlitz, to tell about the most famous one, he would be the first one to walk on the battlefield and to try to find and help wounded soldiers. He's known for that, walking around and finding people and bringing food to the soldiers who are cold and stuff like that, and giving them a coat or what have you. So he cared about these men, but he could send them to their death an hour later. So it's really part of that dichotomy that we have in his spirit. And as for the part that we cannot understand him, I think it is epitomized by the fact that in 1815, the British, they don't hang him. They send him on exile to a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. In my mind, they are scared of him. They don't understand him. He scares them. And they're like, what do we make of this guy? We've never seen somebody like that. He came back from his tiny island of Elba and he walked all the way to Paris and he became emperor again, just by walking. He just came back and said, hey, I'm back in charge. And Louis XVIII fled. So, I understand them that they were scared because they just don't understand what they have before them. He's an alien. To me, his contemporaries could not all understand him. Even the people close to him did not understand him perfectly. I think from what I've read, Josephine might have been the only one to crack some part of him open. I've seen that in their correspondence. You can see that she understood him probably to a deeper level than most people did. And because I think she had I think she was a very intelligent woman and she could see through people more than most people can. And for our last topic for today, we're talking about Napoleon and his legend, so we have to talk about his depiction. And we're gonna talk about the last movie that came out in 2023 by Ridley Scott. And although it pains me a little because, let me get this out in the open, I like Ridley Scott as a director normally. Alien is one of my favorite movies. I found movies like, Gladiator or Kingdom of Heaven, these movies are historically are wrong, but at least they're entertaining and they're nice to look at. In the case of Napoleon, I call it a historic storm, plus a terrible movie. I watched this movie with my wife, and she knows the story of Napoleon. She doesn't know it as well as me, but she was bored during the whole movie. Like, what is going on? It doesn't make sense. You don't understand what's going on. They've managed to take the time period in history where people have the nicest and brightest and most colorful uniforms and the movie is gray and brown. So to me, it's a complete failure, plus there are too many historical errors to even make a list. Just in the trailer you have like 1,000, even though you could see they try to recreate some of the paintings of that era, like Napoleon standing in front of the pyramids. These come directly from paintings that were often commissioned by Napoleon. But to me, they did two big mistakes, because their sources seem to be the Napoleonic propaganda and the British propaganda. Like everything the British said about Napoleon, all the wrong things they said about him, and then all the things he said to elevate himself, and they mix that in some bad scenario, and here's a movie. Yeah. And that gave us that horrendous piece of cinema. But I like your take on it, Louis.
Well, my take is basically your take. I agree. I agree completely. And I might just say that, of course, it's full of historical mistakes, but I'm not one to say, oh, the uniform's wrong there and the battle didn't exactly happen like that. I don't care. It's a movie. It's a movie. It's meant to be enjoyed. The only job that movie has was to be a good movie. And I think it failed. I don't think it was a good movie. My wife had the exact same reaction as your wife. She of course cares about Napoleon, but she's nowhere near as involved as we are. And she just thought it was a bad movie. It's like we thought the dialogues were incredibly poor. The acting is some of the worst I've ever seen with Phoenix. Everything's gray, as you mentioned. This is a time when going to war, you basically wore the best possible clothes, the most colorful clothes. Everything's gray. The battles, I thought, far from them being inaccurate, I thought they were just poorly made. The cavalry charge is 100 guys running around in a field. Nowhere is the epicness of this confrontation, I think, adequately portrayed. I thought there was no character development. I thought it's only Napoleon and Josephine. We don't, one thing another friend of mine said is that the crazy thing about Napoleon is that he was one of many geniuses in that golden generation that came to power right after the French Revolution. I mean, and it's true. I mean, the people like Talleyrand, the people like Fouché, the military men like Murat and Ney and Davout, the civil like Cambacérès and Roderer, they were. And you see no one in the movie. I thought Kingdom of Heaven is one of my favorite movies of all time. I thought it was absolutely epic. You have 7 or 8 characters that are all developed. And there's this wonderful, going back and forth between the Christian and the Muslims, and you like all of them. And they're all amazing. I thought Napoleon was not at all, the movie Napoleon was not at all there in terms of character development. I thought it was an incredibly poor movie. I thought it was incredibly overpriced, $180 million budget. Phoenix didn't know how to play him. In fact, Phoenix said himself he didn't know how to play him when he got to set. And then Scott's attitude when, told, maybe things didn't happen the way you portrayed them, says, oh, you don't know, you weren't there. As if historians, do nothing all day but make up scenarios. I mean, no respect for like this. We're not saying make an exactly accurate movie. We're saying you can take all the liberties you want as long as you make a good movie. And if your movie's not good, then it better be accurate. But you can't make a bad movie that's inaccurate. You simply cannot do that. And I think that's what he made. And I think the numbers of the box office reflected that. It was not a success. It was completely passed over during the Oscars, and I think rightfully so.
Yeah, and I totally agree because I'm with you 100%. I don't mind if a quote-unquote historical movie is not accurate as long as it's entertaining and well made and you want to know what happens to the character, because then if you want to learn more about the history, well, read a book, listen to a podcast, what have you, something that is made for you to learn the facts. If you watch a movie, you want to have a good time. If you want to learn, you watch a documentary. But as you said, this movie failed on both fronts. It's historically completely wrong, and it's boring as hell. There is no other way to say it. It's just badly executed, as you said, badly acted. But you can see Phoenix had no clue what to do. But I think it comes down to the director and his team. There was no guidance. There was no clear line of what to do, and this resulted in that. Yeah, in that terrible movie. And it's too bad because it was with the means that we have today. When you look at other movies, you can do whatever you want and make it beautiful. When you look at the Waterloo movie from the 70s, it's 10 times better. And this movie
it's a wonderful movie.
Yeah, it was done 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And by the way, the listeners, there is big rumors that there is a big project by Steven Spielberg of a mini-series on Napoleon based on a scenario by Kubrick that was written in the 70s or 80s that he never came to fruition. If this comes to fruition, I have much better hope for it because it probably won't be perfect historically either. But, I have more faith in Steven Spielberg than in Ridley Scott at this stage anyway.
Agreed.
So, fingers crossed, it will probably a streaming thing with 6 or 10 episodes, what have you, which is better, if you want to actually develop the story. And hopefully it won't be a disappointment like this movie was. So, before we end our discussion, Louis, can you please remind the listeners, so when is your book coming out, what it's called, and where people can find you?
So the book is called Napoleon's Library, The Emperor, His Books, and Their Influence on the Napoleonic Era. It comes out in the United Kingdom, in England, on May 30th. It is already available for pre-order on Amazon UK or the Pen and Sword website. It then comes out in the US in July with Casemate Publishing, and the French translation will be a little later next year. And you can find me on Twitter if you look at Louis Sarkozy, and the handle is Nap, N-A-P, like Napoleon, Sarkozy.
Great, and I'll make sure to put links in the show notes to your books and to your book, your website, and to your Twitter. So thank you very much, Louis. I really enjoyed that discussion. I had a great time. I'm sure the listeners will have too. I've learned a lot. I'm sure they will too. And I encourage everyone to get a copy of Louis' book. I've read it. It's fantastic. It's well written. It's well researched. And it covers an aspect of that very famous and yet unknown man that you should learn more about. So thank you for listening. Au revoir. You can find the Lafayette We Are Here podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on LafayettePodcast.com. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Lafayette Podcast. You can also reach me on social media or by email. All the links are on the website. The music for this podcast is the Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, arranged and performed by Jérôme Arfouche.